Impact at Family Network on Disabilities. I'm also a board member of FLDCDT and thrilled to be here today. I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Ali Walford, and she's going to introduce our presentation today.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Ali Walford, and I am the program director for the Parent Education Network, which is the PTI that serves the 12 counties on the southeast going up into central Florida. And clearly, I do not look like that beautiful young man on the left. That is my son, Zachary. And so today, Joe and I are going to talk about two amazing stories of self-advocacy that had very, very different journeys, but both ultimately have amazing outcomes.
Now, as we were preparing for this presentation for this conference, we were trying to think about, what is going to be impactful? What do we want to talk about and go over? And Ali and I have two very different experiences that are really aligned in a number of different ways. Ali's perspective is coming from that of a parent helping guide her child and now her adult son through that transitional period. And I'm a person with a disability. I have specific learning disabilities that manifest in language, mathematics, and reading comprehension. And so I'm going to be talking from that perspective of what did it take for me to be successful going through school, some of those stumbling blocks, and then to post-school outcomes, and how did I get where I am today? And Allie's going to help mirror that with Zach's experience and what she went through.
And I do want to share with everybody, I do have his permission. When he was in high school, he didn't like it as much because I just started with FND in 2017, and he's a 2018 graduate. And so that senior year, it was a little bit difficult for him. But now, as he's his third year out of high school, he realizes the impact of his story and has given me permission to share it. Not that I ever needed it.
Okay. So we're going to be going over 4 different really main areas. Getting the diagnosis, looking at strategies, who were our champions, and then never giving up.
So I think what I want the people watching today to get from our story is and you guys know this, you're in this field, is that things are not always as they appear. And if you look at those pictures of his younger years, he and his brother, and that's my husband on the far left, they look really, really happy. They look like they're having a really great time. One of our colleagues has this term that I absolutely love, and she calls it the diagnostiversary. And most parents, they know exactly where they were and what they were doing when they get the diagnosis of their child's disability, whether it's a parent that has a child with Down syndrome and they learn in utero, or child with autism and they learn in 2 years old, 3 years old, or like Joe's family when they, finally learned about him. Our diagnosis was about 2 weeks before his 5th birthday, when he eloped, which I later learned meant running away from his preschool classroom. And it was really terrifying because not only did he get out of the classroom and the building, but he ran across 6 lanes of very, very busy traffic in one of the more urban counties down here in South Florida. So what our beginning part of our journey looked like was he had 19 suspensions in kindergarten and first grade. He had 4 Baker Act hospitalizations in 4 years, and 5 different elementary school placements. We did the entire continuum up to residential with our son. So by the end of first grade, he was in a center school for emotional behavioral disabilities. And I think what's so amazing about our part of the story and our part of the advocacy is the outcome of all the work that we did at the beginning, when we just got this very complicated and terrifying diagnosis when he was younger.
So my story looks a little bit different. I was going along, I was doing fine. I went through kindergarten, I went through first grade, and as I was going through those periods, those different grades, what I was doing was I was mimicking. So, as my parents were reading me stories, as my parents were reading me different books, and I was hearing things in my class, I started memorizing what they were saying and associating it with the book so that when it became my turn to actually read the book, I would be able to repeat back what I had heard. And this is a great skill to have now that a good portion of my job is doing oral presentations. However, I could not read until I was in almost fourth grade because no one recognized the fact that I wasn't reading. So I remember very specifically the day that things changed. I was in Miss B's class, and she said, I just failed another test. We had a parent teacher conference the next day, and she said, Joe failed another test. What are we going to do? Da da da. And my mom had looked over and she said, can we read him the test? Like, I know he knows this. Can we just read him the test? So they read me the test and I got 100 on it. I answered every single question. I remember it was about the precipitation of the rain. So the different types of clouds, the cumulus, and then the precipitation, evaporation, all of it. I got 100. And it was that day that my parents set an appointment to get me evaluated for learning disability. And they pulled me out of private school and put me into public school so I could access FAPE and get an IEP to get the services that I needed. So that was really the first stage in our journey. We're going to go over to strategies and what kind of took place to help move things along or gunk things up.
So I'm really, really into modeling. I was a very, very intentional parent. I had to be. And this is a little bit different for me because usually spend a lot of time talking about the early part of our journey because that was when we experienced the most challenges. But, this is a transition conference and, I wanted to focus on his experiences when he turned 14 and moving up. So if you see on the left there, that's actually a YouTube video of him presenting to his our school board. And he's about 15 years old there. He's a sophomore at a local high school. Why that is particularly amazing is, like I shared in the previous slide, he was at a center school. And, when we were going through that process of changing his environment, his placement, and everybody said, don't do it, don't do it. Once you go to a center school, you never go out. That wasn't an option for us. That wasn't an option. So I always modeled very strong advocacy for my son. And as you can see, he took after me in that. And I really appreciated that. What I think I would like you guys to take away as I'm sure most of the 35 of you are the boots in the ground in the classroom. When our youth are self-advocating, it's really important to listen to them. We don't necessarily have to give them the answer that they want, but it is so important not to just push them away. I think that was one of his biggest complaints and frustrations that he had when he was in high school. He's like, you talk about this self-advocating all the time, but this one particular teacher, so and so, she was just my way or the highway. And so, I think the other part too is when working with the parents, talking about the importance of teaching the child how to talk about their disability or communicate about their disability. So on the left, he is actually advocating for our county to close its seclusion rooms and improve its restraint policies. And they did. They did the following year, which was pretty amazing. And he's actually been working with me this year with the bills that are coming forward again to that are, hopefully we'll get out of legislation this year. And then on the right, he's on a stage with one of our with our superintendent, and he had such a great question. Had such a great question. And Joe, I did not tell him which question to ask. He did this all on his own. But this is his junior year. So this is now this year I was our advisory chair. I was our ESC advisory chair, and I would have him come to meetings with me because we didn't want the parents to have younger children to have that as a barrier. And we couldn't have babysitting. So we had high school students and student leaders volunteer at our advisory to watch the younger students. So he would hear those concerns we were talking about, again, the modeling. And we were able to get him back in a general education high school. And he actually went to a magnet technical high school that he had to apply for. And his specialist was one of your nominees yesterday. So that was really special to see her get nominated. But his question was, what do you do? How do you support those ESE specialists and those support facilitators that have huge caseloads? I'm at a high school that has like 350 kids, but my buddy's at a high school that has 4,000 kids. And what are we doing to help support those support facilitators that support us? And I was just so very, very proud of it. And so the modeling does work, and in I think incorporating the parents in part of that picture as much as we can will help the youth find their voice. Because if it's happening at home and it's happening at school, they're kind of getting saturated with those ways to express their wants and needs.
So middle school. So we come out of elementary school. In elementary school, the IEP, I got my IEP in fourth grade. We put in strategies, we put in different accommodations, and they were working. I learned how to read, I was catching up to my classmates, and it was working for what I needed. Then middle school hits. You have new social pressures, you have 6 classes, you have more intensive coursework. There's just a lot coming at you at one time. And the new curriculum I was learning, the new material I was learning, those old strategies we were using did not work. So what was I to do? Well, we ended up having a number of IEP meetings throughout my middle school career. We had 2 or 3 a year to try to figure out what was going to work. And the biggest thing for me, my biggest pet peeve of what had happened was I would sit at this IEP table, and mom and dad and everyone else at the table would look over at me and say, "Joe, what do you need to be successful in reading?" I don't know. No one asked me. No one talked to me beforehand. We didn't discuss this. Joe, what do you need to be successful in math? What accommodations do you need? Do you have a book of accommodations? I don't know. Like we hadn't, no one had taken the time to really thoroughly go over what are some accommodations, and not just you have this type of disability, these are the accommodations you get, but how are the struggles I'm having both socially, academically, emotionally? How are all of those things going to be addressed so that I can succeed and achieve in middle school? And guess what? I didn't. I didn't achieve. I made it through by the skin of my teeth. And then I went into high school. And I was telling Allie the other day, when I went into high school, my first day of high school, I remember very specifically thinking, I wonder how long I'll be here before I drop out. Because that is how distraught I was. That is how broken down I was through middle school, not getting services, not succeeding. I was getting services, but they weren't the right services, and I wasn't succeeding. And my self-esteem was just, I knew it was down here on the first day of high school. So that was my attitude. What am I going to do once I drop out of high school?
Yeah, we had a very similar experience with Zach. In it We did okay in high school, but I actually kind of really advocated for this particular slide because it jumps ahead a little bit. But when he transitioned from high school to college, this is what he looked like. This was his freshman year. And, I want to touch on biases. We all have biases. We all have been in all kinds of trainings that talk about it. But if you look at that picture, do you see a young man that's going to say the words, "There is strength in forgiveness, just as there was weakness in being vengeful. Open your heart, and maybe you wouldn't be so sad all the time"? This is how introspective he was because he had so much therapy to deal with his, just really significant impulse control and behaviors. I mean, You don't have 19 suspensions as a 5 and a 6-year-old for no reason at all. And you don't, as a parent, you don't want to put your child in an institution for a 72-hour hold if there's not significant reasons. But I just think it's important, as you'll see at the end of the presentation, and I'm really aware of the time because time just really flies. You'll see that there's always something more and deeper below the surface.
So we're going to talk about who were some of our champions or what were our champions. Oftentimes we think of champions as a singular person, but really we're going to talk about what made things work and what helped.
So for us, this is him at his technical high school, and that is the second floor. And when I saw the picture, I was like, really the second floor? Like if you go to the left, we've got broken arms and legs. If you go to the right, you look like a fool. But it was really his ESE specialist and his support facilitator. And being at a school where they had the time and the philosophy to meet his needs. But we really wanted him to be his own champion. That was very important to us, that he found his voice, he used his voice, and that people listened to him when he used his voice. And then, Joe, if you go to the next slide, some of his other champions was his scouting troop. So look at this. Imagine this. You have a 6-year-old that's in a classroom with only 5 other young people that all have significant behavioral challenges. Where's the modeling going to be that I talked about earlier for that? So we put him in Cub Scouts, and we really just did it for socialization. Well, I am so proud to say he's one of the 3% of young people that joined scouting that actually earned his Eagle Scout. But up until that point, he was really only seen for his disability. He was known as the kid that blows up. He was known as the kid that has the room clear. He was known as the kid that the blue mats were going to come out for the restraints. And once we got him into scouting, and he had those opportunities to see, how his peers behaved, he did a little bit of the mimicking that Joe did, that was in a little bit more of a positive way. It also gave him a sense of belonging. We do a lot of talking about peer pressure, but I don't think we do enough talking about a sense of belonging in a community that is so important for our youth. And that's why I'm a real big fan of best buddies and peers as partners in learning. The more inclusion that we can do on our high school campuses, the more I think everyone benefits, because, I often say, and it'll come up in one of the future slides, life does not have a stress walk. Life does not have a self-contained classroom. He became trusted as a leader. He was leading other young boys. So in this picture, it's probably about his sophomore year, and he had a den or whatever his subgroup was within the troop. And, he had that opportunity to practice those leadership skills. And through that, he also found hobbies that he didn't know that he enjoyed. So we live, 3 minutes away from the ocean on the East Coast, hates the ocean, won't walk in sand, won't go in the water, but he loves whitewater rafting. We wouldn't have known that if we hadn't popped him in scouts and really went with something that was a sense of community that was going to work for him. And what it offered too was a really independent, safe place for him to learn about personal responsibility without any judgment. And we had to prepare that environment. We had to let the adults in that community know, and that's part of disclosure. And so we talked with him. What do you want them to know? What do you not want them to know? And it really helped him develop who he wanted to become as a young man. And so, Joe, I think you call that your tipping point, don't you?
I did. So just like Zach, until now is only seen by my disability, and that is the reality. So like I shared in the last section, when I went into high school, I was literally thinking, how long am I going to be here until I drop out? That's where I was. Now, freshman year, I met Miss Aliberto. Miss Aliberto was my English teacher. She also happened to be the yearbook teacher. And what ended up happening is, I ended up going and helping with yearbook. I was bored at lunch. I didn't really know anyone. I was a freshman. So I connected with Miss Alberto and I ended up going and volunteering during my lunch hour and helping with yearbook. Well, I wasn't good at math. I wasn't good at science. I wasn't good at reading. I definitely wasn't good in her English class. And all of my grades were pretty much, where I expected them to be, as low as they could be. And so Miss Alberto ended up taking a camera and putting it in my hand. And she's like, you know what? If you're going to be in here, you got to do something. Go take some pictures. Go do some stuff for yearbook. And so I did. And I came back and they weren't half bad. And I ended up taking some more photos. And then for my birthday that year in November, I asked my parents for like an advanced point and shoot, something a little bit better than the little square ones. And they got it for me, and I did better and better. And then I started learning Photoshop and InDesign. And by my sophomore year, I was already an editor on the yearbook. And then by my junior year, I was editor in chief of the yearbook. And by my senior year, I was editor in chief of the yearbook and the newspaper. And so as I started progressing and I started learning these different skills, learning InDesign, Photoshop, photography, gaining social leadership skills, being able to join other clubs, all of these different things propelled me in my self-esteem. And self-esteem is not something to undermine or to think that it's not important. When my self-esteem was down here, all of my grades reflected. And as I started gaining self-esteem and believing in myself of what I could do, because this was the very first time in my life that someone didn't look at me for my deficits. This was the very first time in my life that I was being praised for being able to do something well. Every other time at home, at school, it was, you can't, you're not, why can't you? You need to do better. And I was trying, but I wasn't able to. So, really, being shown that I have value, being shown that I have purpose was absolutely my tipping point. Um, and that brings me into graduation. So by the time that I graduated my senior year, I graduated from a magnet program. I was on homecoming court, winter court, prom court, and then looking towards next steps, and that was going up to Tallahassee to go to TCC and then FSU. And I never would have thought I could get to this point. I could have gotten to that point when I stepped into high school. And to be honest with you, what changed was the environment I was in. It was being involved in yearbook, being involved in those extracurriculars, because the accommodations I received didn't really change that much. It was the same, let's use this playbook. Let's give these same accommodations for a student with learning disabilities. And we didn't even consider the other things that would bring value and purpose to my journey. And that is what changed my path.
Yeah, that's a really good point, Joe. I hadn't thought about that really until you just said it, was that some of the extracurriculars that he did in high school outside of scouting. And that really brings us to our last point, that never give up. And from a parent point of view, by the time our children get to you at 14, we're tired. We're really tired, especially if they've had their IEP since they were little like we did. And I really like, what you reminded me of that, Joe, is it's treating the whole child, treating the whole person. Are they equipped socially, emotionally? Can they pivot when they need to, when they experience something that they're not liking? Can they do it appropriately? So I think many of you know who Joe, through Zach and I, are standing in between. That's Jordan Nab. And so Joe, like I said, I was working at a mental health agency. I was very happy in a role called a certified recovery peer specialist. And that just meant that I used to be a hot mess and now I'm just a warm mess. And my warm mess self was running an ESC advisory meeting in a very strident advocate community in South Florida. And I was managing the meeting pretty well. And Joe asked me out to breakfast. And I'm like, sounds a lot like a job interview. And it was. And I wound up joining FND. And I shared part of our story at one of the Winter Institutes. And Jordan came up to me and he's like, do you think your son will talk? Do you think your son would share? Like, so this is Zach and I presenting together at the first Healthy Minds, Healthy Futures conference. And I still get really choked up when I think about that because I gave him so many opportunities to have an out because I knew he wasn't a public speaker. I am not exactly shy. I like people, I like talking, but that's not my kiddo. He's really introspective and he likes the safety of his little circle. And so the night before the presentation, we're in a hotel room in Orlando and he's like, yeah, I changed my mind. I don't really want to do this. And I'm like, oh, no, 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 that is not how that works. I gave you all kinds of outs with that. So with my, therapy and my background, there's a phrase that I absolutely live my life by, and it's just show up. So even if I don't want to be there, if I just show up, I'll be able to find out one good thing from that experience. And we really used that particular strategy that morning. And we just showed up and it was not a dry eye in the room. There was like 35 people in there and I was really trying to back away and let him use his voice. And it was very powerful. It was very powerful for both of us. But what I want you to take away from this is even with all of this hard work, one of our big lessons is I wish I would have listened to our specialist more, our ESC specialist, and scaffold back quicker. So he had a stress pass. He's a big guy. I mean, I'm a big woman. He's a big guy. He's 6'5", and he's a brown boy. His dad's Jamaican. And when he gets, really elevated, it can be, a little bit of a frightening situation. So up until his senior year, he had that stress walk. Well, my dear boy can get a job. He just really struggles with keeping one. And as a matter of fact, Joe, I hadn't told you this yet, but we were up, at my parents recently, and he goes, Mom, that same feeling I had when I walked out of a teacher's class who wasn't listening to me, that's the same thing I do with my jobs. I just don't have any tolerance to put up with it. And I'm like, that's not really how life works, but I'm glad you had that realization. So and we'll talk about this in a minute, but he's working away his adult strategies on how to not just kind of bolt. And I think, whether you're an individual who lives with a disability or not, fight or flight is ingrained in our human makeup. His refusal to disclose, that's another area that I would work a little bit harder on, especially with those invisible disabilities, because the world doesn't see it. Why am I going to tell them about it? And that has been a real barrier in his college experience. But he's plugging away. And then finally, when him saying to me, I'm really glad that you can help others with our story. That was very, very powerful to me because I really thought he was going to come to that point where he's like, yeah, lady, quit talking about me. I'm 21 years old. I don't, I'm not who I was when I was 6 and I ran across, 8 lanes of traffic or whatever. So, but the working hard, it's very, very important, but it's also important to work smart.
So I went from high school to TCC and then FSU. And I talked earlier about my learning disability manifesting in mathematics, languages, reading comprehension. Those are some of the main areas. Now, when I was in TCC, there are two main areas that I struggled with and had to work in getting out of. And guess what? That was mathematics and languages. So mathematics, I ended up having to work with the Disability Support Center, getting a waiver out of college algebra and taking another course for it. that was one of those sticking points that very easily could have ended my college career. I was not about to pass college algebra. And so I worked that out. Great, let's keep going. I'm passing my courses. I'm studying 24/7. I'm taking a different approach to school, and I'm making A's and B's. And I'm thrilled. I'm really, really excited. But college Spanish, it was horrible. I had never, because I was in a magnet program and I was taking yearbook and newspaper, I never took a foreign language in high school. So I had to take it in college. Now, my first semester, I took Spanish from a woman from Cuba, and I failed it. Then Spanish 1, my second semester, was a woman from the Dominican Republic, which are very different ways of speaking Spanish, and I failed that. Then I took Spanish 1 again for a third time, and it was from a woman from, she was also from Cuba, but spoke much slower and enunciated as she was speaking. Okay, I passed that, barely, with a C, a flat C. Then my second Spanish 2, I took it from a woman who was from the Bronx in New York City with a thick New York accent. And then she had lived in Mexico for a while and was teaching Spanish, not a native speaker. And I failed that. Then my summer semester going to FSU, all of the folks in the FSU application department, they knew me by name. I had all of my other credits. My application was in, it was on pending status. It was on hold for acceptance, pending, like I was ready. And the only course I had was Spanish 2 that I had to pass with a flat C. So I was already registered at the Disability Support Center. I go to the professor. He's this guy from Connecticut that lived in Costa Rica for a while. And again, not a native speaker. He was an adjunct professor that was a grad student at FSU. And I had said to him, hey, I'm registered at the Disability Support Center. I'm not trying to get something I don't deserve, but all of your exams are multiple choice. Is there any way I can do an oral exam, or I can do a written exam, like something else to demonstrate that I know enough information to get a C? That's all I'm asking for. It's just a flat C. I know enough to get that. He looks at me and goes, Joe, I don't believe in learning disabilities. You're going to take the same test in the same way as everyone else, in the same amount of time, in the same room. And if that's an issue, you don't have to take this class. And so I said, thank you so much. I walked out of the room, and that was one of those, again, a turning points. I could have been stopped, or I could have blown up, and that would have been a bigger issue. But I went to the Dean of Communications, and I explained what happened. I explained how I am registered with the Disability Support Center. I have protections under 504 of the Rehab Act, since the TCC receives federal funding, and under ADA. And at that point, I was able to do something called preguntas orales, and so oral questions, and I got a C. I will say, though, that when he asked me how many siblings I had, I said I was an only child. I have 4 siblings. When he asked me how big my house was, I said I lived in a studio apartment, because I knew that if I said I had 4 siblings, he would ask me what their names were and how to describe them and where do they live. I didn't want to answer all those things. But at the end of the day, I passed with a C. And as I left, the reason I tell this story is, as I left, he took the time to stop me in the hallway and tell me, you will never speak Spanish. You will never progress in language. Don't even try. Ay, Dios mío, ahora sí me puedo hablar español. Es como que la gente no pienses qué podríamos hacer cuando tenemos una oportunidad, realidad. So when I went to FSU, I had the opportunity to go live in Guatemala and study human trafficking and human rights abuses from the dictatorships that were going on for decades, from the 80s to the 90s, or from the 50s to the 90s. And I lived in small communities. This is a community I lived in for over a year called Chantala in the Highlands region. And this is just, it's the epitome of when someone tells you you can't, they have no idea what you're capable of. At FSU, I worked for AP Press as a faux journalist. That's part of the way I put myself through college. I worked as a faux journalist. I've been published in every continent across the world. I worked as a photo editor for the student newspaper, which was the biggest one in the country. I worked for the Tri-County newspaper. And the reality is some of the skills I learned there, those same motivations is what's pushing me in my job today. And just remember, with focus and planning, you can literally be anything.
So I'm waiting. I'm waiting for my guy to have that aha moment, Joe. But as you can see there, he's doing one of his Instagram posts, and he has been employed for last 5 months now, and he's had some opportunities where he's wanted to walk off his job and he hasn't. And it has been that persistence, and it's been that language of personal responsibility, you know. um he is at what should be, if you go in conventional terms, the end of his junior year, because he did graduate in 2018. He at one point had a point 0.3 GPA in college. A point 0.3. Like, you have to really be struggling, I think, to go down to a point 0.3. He has been able to raise that up independently to a 2.1, because we were actually just talking about this yesterday. You remember, Joe, when you said before the pandemic you would literally be in Key West on Monday and Pensacola on Tuesday? Well, he expects the same thing from his directors. And I could be down in Key West as well, and then over in Clewiston, in 2 days later. So I wasn't the same type of helicopter mom I was in high school when he went to college. And I think he really, really learned that idea that natural consequences can be positive or can be negative. And so with that really hard work that he's put in, he's brought his GPA up to a 2.1. He does still refuse to disclose. He will not use the Disability Services Office. He will not ask for help. But he is actually asking to potentially talk to a therapist again. We're trying to find a good fit for that. And he really wants to be an architect. And there's a lot involved to be an architect. And I'm just really proud of him for sticking through with it. But as with all of our children, they hear what we say. They really listen to and take in what the adults are saying around them. And I just think that that's very, very important. So if you, as a transition specialist or a supervisor or a discretionary project person, you may be aware of that, but the parents that you're working with, they may not have really learned that lesson yet. So if you can find those gentle ways to just remind them that, our children, they watch and they see and they take in a lot more than we realize. But what I have a great confidence in is whatever Zach decides to do, he's going to be successful at it. He's going to be successful at it because I know that I have given him all of the tools to find his success. Now, what might be the challenges is I may not see his success the way he sees his success. And that is very hard as parent, is accepting that, hey, I want to take this, route and become a streamer. Well, wait, I thought you wanted to be an architect. No, I don't want to be an architect. I want to be a streamer. Okay, just pay your car insurance and your rent and you do what you want to do. But it's been really interesting journey, and I really wish I had had these skills just a little bit sooner. But I'm so proud and so happy to be part of this organization and help out, 1/3 of those 400,000 kids that have an IEP or 504 plan.
This is the ending photo I'm going to leave y'all with for my story. So going from that student who couldn't read until he was in third, fourth grade, who was mimicking, who was ready to drop out in high school, was expecting to drop out in high school. This is the National OSEP conference. If you're not familiar with the term OSEP, OSEP is the Office of Special Education Programs in the Federal Department of Education. They oversee the implementation of IDEA special education across the country. So they are who Bees directly reports to, the Florida Department of Ed reports to. This is the OSEP National Leadership Conference. And right here is Monica Veritarato, who is the former bureau chief for the Department of Special Education in Florida. And myself, Monica, and one of my colleagues got to present together at the leadership conference, talking about different strategies for engaging families and stakeholders. Now, did I ever think my life was going to get here? No. Was this my path? No. Am I thrilled that I'm here? Absolutely. And I'm glad that we can all work together. Now, Allie, if you can just go over this very quickly, because we've got about 4 minutes left and I want to see if there's any questions.
You know what, Joe? I think the picture speaks for itself. I really do. You need more than an invitation. You need to offer the path, the strategies, the skills, because a triangle is not going to make it through a circle hole. A square is not going to make it through a circle hole. So they can be themselves all they want, but if the environment's not prepared for them to walk through, they're still going to be stuck with barriers.
So if anyone has any questions, please go ahead and put them in the chat section. I'm just reading through one of the questions now.
Well, Joe, I can answer the end of Kate's question.
Yeah.
The just showing up. You said you're asking how to push through things you find uncomfortable. A lot of life is just uncomfortable. And for my son, we used a timer a lot for a lot of different reasons. And it was just show up for 2 minutes, just show up for 6 minutes, just show up for 8 minutes. And that evolved for him to just show up in a whole work shift or something. And I know that sounds very easy and very simple, but often it's the simple things that really work.
And so for the first part of your question, you're in the Thrive program. You have to take a class that is teaching mathematics in early childhood settings. Not really good at math. What would you do to be successful in this class? So I told everyone that I got a waiver out of college algebra. That was allowed. However, when I went to FSU, I majored in criminology, specifically focusing on Latin American human rights violations. And I had to take criminal statistics. Statistics is absolutely a mathematics course. And it was a graduate level course I had to take. So to your point, Kate, what I ended up doing is every single day that the professor offered office hours, I showed up. I went over the office hours with her, and then I found peer support. So I went to the study lab and worked with students my age to help understand that content. And at the end of the semester, I passed it with a C. I'm not saying, I keep talking about passing with a C. I'm not saying strive for C's through all of your courses, but there are some things where, are you going to be teaching math? If you're going to be teaching math, strive for a little bit higher. If you're not going to be teaching math, really is that going to help on your core focus and your core subjects? No. So get past it, achieve, and then focus on your core strengths that you're going to be teaching on. Alrighty, well, we are just coming up to our time now. So Allie put her email inside of the chat box. Both Allie and I's profile are attached to Family Network on Disabilities inside of the sponsorship section. So please go ahead and go there. Feel free to reach out to us if you have any questions, if you'd like to have either one of us work with your district or your individual school. And again, thank you so much for listening to our journey.